Perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. I hope you had a wonderful long weekend. I want to start by saying what this webinar is not about. This is not about work from home. Let's reinvent work from home. I don't care about that. This is not about office conversion to residential. Maybe a good idea, maybe not, but this is not what this webinar is about. This is about the flexibility of uses in the built environment and future developments. And I think that's key to understand that. So because I want to keep the format short, and we have 4 speakers. Let's dive right into it. I have 4 incredible speakers. They will introduce themselves. So let's get started. Maurice, the stage is yours.
Good morning. Okay. Thanks, Nama, for putting this together. I think it's interesting to start off with, though, this is not what it is about today, and this is what it is. And it's kind of a blurry line in my mind, in that we are talking about, live work as a defined use in the Planning Act, but really the state of live work in a post-pandemic world, I think is a very interesting one. And while this is not about work from home, I think that it is about just understanding high level, how can we deliver more flexibility in the uses of space that is immediately accessible to, the public realm of any building. And we need to also think about, within that flexibility, what are the hurdles? And what is sort of the future of live work units, and who are the users, and what are we really talking about attracting here? So I think that we're going to go into a lot of interesting discussions. I don't know how to mute whatever is ringing beside me, so you guys are going to bear with me. I'm sharing my screen. Everybody can see. Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so Fora is a relatively new name in the industry. We've only been around about a year and a half. In that year and a half, we've put together about a half a dozen deals. Some have live work. Prior to Fora, I was also president and founder of a company called Collective. And prior to that, I was VP of development at a company called Shiplake. And within all of my roles, I had some exposure to the live work world. And so, what we're doing today at Fora and the projects that have live work units, I think is a lot of lessons learned, for sure. And a lot of speculation in my mind. This project is called the Station Condos, is a project that is built in very close proximity to the Wilson subway station at Wilson and the Allen Road. I just went out here. I think this project is over a decade old. I know these are live work units, right? So this is along Tippett Road off of Wilson. This is the Tippett Road frontage, and you can see, there's a Kibo, which is an interesting thing, and I think we could talk about what's allowed and what's not. Some sort of a travel agency. And on the right, there was some sort of more of a recording studio type of space, from what I could see from peeking in the windows. And that second floor, or that mezzanine floor, as is often defined, is the live component. And kitty corner to that project, under my leadership while I was at Collective, we launched and started construction on this project we call it 500 Wilson. 500 Wilson used to be 3 different buildings, 470, 490, which were residential, and 530. 530 Wilson was an old office building. And as part of the office replacement program with the city, we had some of the non-residential or commercial replacement space allocated to our live work unit components. And as you can see, I'm showing on the left a rendered image immediately adjacent to the park, there's sort of that two-story element. And then the plans on the right show what would be right on the corner, adjacent to the park. There's on the ground floor, the work unit, if you will. And on the mezzanine floor, immediately above it, is the live component. And it's interesting, the few little design decisions that were made here. You can see, looking at the floor plan of the work unit, we have a door to the street. And once you're inside the commercial unit, you have that X is a heat pump, so an HVAC unit, and there's a powder room. There's some columns because it's in the corner of the building and there's structure. But you can't access the corridor from here. And you can see then there's a door to a stairwell, and that's from the corridor. And when you're inside the building, on the within the internal part of the building, you access the stairwell that goes up to the live part of the unit, and it's really separate and apart. And that was a design decision that was a few-fold, but one of the interesting components I wanted to touch on is that in order to really satisfy some of the city requirements and ensure that the work part, the ground floor part of the live work unit, that was going to count towards our non-residential replacement, stayed truly as an isolated commercial unit, we had to do this. And we didn't want to sort of blur the line, and we didn't want to have, when I say we, collectively, we agreed, we weren't going to have any part of a residential unit component on the ground floor, and it would just be used for commercial purposes. So there's no kitchen here, there's no shower here, as you can see. And then sort of fast forward to one of my current applications. This is 2400 and 2440 Dundas Street West, the two green towers and the red tower, green and yellow and red tower, are the proposal for the redevelopment of the site. It's a site that's at Bloor and Dundas Street, connected to the Up Express and the Bloor Go, and I guess 100 or so meters away from the Bloor subway line. So it really is a major transit hub. And as you can see on the right, there's sort of this render view of a public space in front, and then the split between building A and building B, sort of the two tower and the single tower component, is an entrance into the Go and Up Express through the rear of our site. And through the front of a site, we really created this public space. And whether it ultimately becomes park, land dedication, or POPs, or a combination thereof, I think that'll unfold itself through the process. But what we did is fronting that public space. You can see in the render, it says Photo Studio Artist Co-op, Aquaspace or something, Apothecary. Like, we're just showing, for placement, sort of for artistic visioning, what that space could look like. But we are talking about, again, bringing that sort of use in here. And what's interesting about including the live work component in our application here is that this was a result of some early days community consultation, working with the West Bend Residents Association and saying, we are going to make a proposal here. This is what we think are the elements of the proposal. And, what do you think? And before really solidifying our proposal, we gathered a lot of feedback and comments, and it changed a little bit of the traffic patterns on the site. But it also helped us dedicate this stuff to, I'll say, smaller scale operators, artisanal operators, perhaps. And that's something that was well received by the community. And it was an interesting part of the process. We were debating between the panelists when we all got together last week, whether there is a value comparison that's worth mentioning. This is data from a project that was launched back in 2019. And you could just see our live work units versus our residential units and the delta between those on an average size. So naturally, the live work unit being on 2 stories is going to be on average bigger than the average condo unit in the building. And as we all know, that has most often an impact on the price per square foot and obviously on the sticker price, the ultimate selling price of the unit. And as you can see, the live work unit has a much lower price per square foot on the revenue side and a much higher end price. And that was the case, like I said, in 2019. And in order to even move the inventory, despite the discount, we had to make an additional, I'll say, incentive towards the market by having a smaller deposit structure. Again, you're talking about just a bigger dollar amount. Interestingly, they sold very well. So, you know, could you be pushing that revenue and deposit structure to be closer to a conventional condo unit for your average buyer? Probably. I think that there's going to be more and more appeal to these type of units in the city, and we're going to see the type of, you know, gap that we're showing in the difference column probably shrink a little bit, but that's me being speculative. I hope I'm allowed to do that, Nama. And then, you know, I added, I guess, some of the, I don't think we need to get into this, but I'm flashing it on the screen. This is, you know, excerpts from some agreements of purchase and sale, stuff that's allowed, stuff that's sort of restricted. Since it's recorded, I think everybody can, you know, go through that and then understand. But this was in cooperation with some of the condo lawyers that we work with that said, this is the type of stuff we typically include in these agreements. It really provides quite a bit of leniency. And it provides, you know, I think a lot of decisions that have to be made in the end can be made through the condo corporation working together with the operator of that live work unit, whether it's on things like signage, whether it's on things like hours of operation, whether it's on things like, you know, who your target market is. But yeah, we've had, I guess, to wrap it all up, we've had quite a bit of exposure into live work units in different parts of the city. I've seen them be successful. I've seen them be purchased in some cases by investors, in some cases by end users, owner occupiers, let's call it. I've seen them be occupied by, you know, stay occupied, perhaps with a little bit more success than your conventional retail space at grade for new multi-res mixed-use buildings. And maybe that's just anecdotal and maybe it's just locational and it has happened that way. But I think that there's an interesting market here. You want to balance out having your major, you know, national anchor tenants like your grocers and drugstores and banks and those type of folks, and weave into the fabric of what we're planning some of the opportunities that this tenure really allows. So with that, Nama, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, let's jump right to Sujin's presentation. The idea is that we will have kind of a deck presentation from each of the speakers for 5 minutes. Don't invite Maurice to a webinar that was 17 minutes, Maurice. No, I'm kidding. Let's jump right into Sujin's, and so we can have like Q&A.
I think we started 5 minutes late, so it really was 12.
Okay. Sujin, you're muted. You're muted.
Hi, can you? Great. And you can all see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with some definitions. Live, a place for personal habitat. Work, a place of mental or physical activity as a means of earning income. So then, what is live work? The concept of live work is nothing new. Whether it's the traditional Japanese machiya to the cobbler living above his shop, the idea of live work has been around for centuries. Historians trace this shift away from live work units to a few things: the Industrial Revolution, changes to transportation policy, and the rise of single-use zoning. By the 1950s, live work units in the United States were mainly against the law or highly discouraged. So looking at Toronto's recent history of live work, zoning bylaw 43886, live work unit, means a dwelling unit is also used for work purposes, provided only the resident or residents of such accommodation work in the dwelling unit, except in an RA district where the dwelling unit may also be used for work purposes by any number of persons. So this is considered a residential use. It's not permitted in an R zone, but it was permitted in an RA zone and a CR zone. Fast forward to 2013, the term live work is removed and replaced with home occupation. Home occupation is still considered a residential use and is now permitted in certain residential zones. And it still has limitations on outside customers. A sample of an OMB decision for a project on Yonge Street, the definition of live work was extended to allow for persons not residing in a dwelling unit to work in a live work unit. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of a project, but we had one mid-rise project on an avenue where the client was proposing live work at grade instead of retail. However, the city required that because this was a residential use, it needed a front yard setback to provide proper separation from the public sidewalk to the private residential uses. I'll skip the details of the project for now, but I'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities with live work that came from this experience. Because of the confusion on whether live work is residential or commercial in nature, the implementation of a front yard setback for the live portion really does become an issue. Over the next few slides, I'll highlight different aspects to take into consideration and what some of the challenges and perhaps opportunities for change there may be. First is on some current planning regulations and design guidelines that limit the future opportunity of live work growth. This is an image taken from the Avenues and Mid-Rise Building Study from May 2010. These images describe the eventual transformation of an avenue. But note, it really only shows mixed-use mid-rises. Included in these guidelines are various performance standards. The general principle being commercial at grade could be at 0 lot line, but residential uses should be set back. From an overall avenue planning perspective, if you implement these setback guidelines, what can result is an irregular planned form of buildings, some at property lines, others set back. This can result in irregular streetscapes, not to mention portions of sidewalls exposed and left blank, where the residential is set back against the commercial. The next challenge is recognizing not all streets are ready for commercial at grade. While there may be an opportunity for later, there are a lot of other factors that come into play when it comes to developing commercial uses. It's not as simple as if you build it, they will come. Setting back an entire building facade of a mid-rise building to meet the criteria of a residential front yard setback will basically kill any developer's pro forma. There could also be a conflicting regulation with zoning. For instance, some parts of Eglinton require all front walls to be between 0 and 0.5 meters from the front property line. Active retail nodes create vibrant city streets. Vacant commercial storefronts kills this animation. Portions of avenues that are predominantly residential in nature need time to develop density that will support the commercial uses. Otherwise, you'll be left with swaths of vacant storefronts. Because live work is considered primarily a residential use, residential planning principles are currently what apply. However, in order to properly future-proof an ability to convert the purely commercial use, once density and market actually catches up, I'd like to propose the opportunity for change is by allowing live work at grade with 0 lot line setbacks, which allows this to be an intermediary type of use that can address current market realities while providing flexibility for future change. And of course, there are a lot of other challenges with live work that are beyond just a front yard setback. Addressing both zoning and OBC, definitions of use, classifications, safety, and a whole bunch of other questions like, are there limitations on the type of commercial use? Are there limitations on the number of customers someone can have in their live work unit? Are there limitations on the number of bedrooms permitted in a live work? Are there limitations on hours of business versus safety and noise? Are there limitations to signage? How is the work component of live work enforced post-occupancy? How does barrier-free accessibility play into live work units? Do they all need to be barrier-free? Since there is a live component to live work, how does this affect a tenant's rental rights? What sort of lease agreements are signed? Are they residential or commercial in nature? Are there issues with bedroom and natural light? And the list goes on. In 2014, Jacob Morgan published a book called The Future of Work: Attract New Talent, Build Better Leaders, and Create a Competitive Organization, and produced this visual. Back in 2014, he forecasted much of what is now a current reality. While this visual is more about the evolution of a typical corporate employee, it speaks not only to changes in the employment industry, but how social culture is going to and has evolved. Back to definitions, if live is a place of personal habitat and work is a place of mental or physical activity as a means of earning income, then it's an interesting discussion to be had about how live and work can and will evolve. How work is done, the rise of entrepreneurship, how businesses are run, and how consumers consume are all rapidly evolving. So I'll leave with this question. As the social and cultural approach to work continues to evolve, what is the optimal typology to embrace this evolution? Thank you.
Thank you, Sujin. Jeffrey, you're next. Covering the building code, not as a whole, just the live work stuff and office and residential. Go for it.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff. I'm a code consultant with CodeNext. I've been in the industry for 12-ish, 13-ish years now. And we're just going to touch on live work units. There's a lot of nuances with these requirements. We're not going to cover everything. This is just supposed to be a brief overview. So under the OBC, live work unit is a defined term. And I'm actually glad that Sujin brought up the zoning definition, because under the building code, it's slightly different. So I produced it here. I'm just going to read it directly, and we'll break it down piece by piece. So live work unit means a dwelling unit having an area of not more than 200 meters squared that contains a subsidiary business and personal services occupancy, or a subsidiary low hazard industrial occupancy, and which is used and operated by one or more persons of a single household. So within that definition, it says a lot. And sometimes when clients come to us with questions, we find the answers right in the definition, and we'll break it down piece by piece. Okay, so this is just a very rudimentary diagram of a building. You have 4 floors with the live work unit on the first 2 levels, and separate units on the 3rd and 4th. I'll let you pretend what the 3rd and 4th floor units are. They're immaterial to this discussion. We're focused on the live work component. One thing to note here is that the red lines denote fire separations, whereas the dotted line in the live work is just a floor assembly. It's not necessarily a fire separation. The key to us here is that term dwelling unit, which we would consider a primary driver. Under the OBC, we would classify the unit as a Group C residential occupancy. And as a resident or as a dwelling unit, under the code, it affords a certain amount of leniency. 2 examples are fire separations. So provided that your building and the unit is designed appropriately to code, there's allowances to have your floor assemblies be waived in terms of rating and fire separation. So you can have stairs between your floor levels. Also, in terms of egress, the egress for dwelling units are a bit more lax. For example, it allows you to travel down one story to reach an exit rather than having direct exits, access to exits on each floor level. One of the restrictions is the work component. It specifically limits you to Group D, business and personal services, and Group F, Division 3, low hazard industrial occupancies. And lastly is the operation by a single household. To us, this is important because as a single household, you have control over the types of hazards and functions in your space, and there's a familiarity with the overall layout and access to exits. So the OBC is only one component and the only one I can really speak to. There's other things that you need to consider when designing your building and your units. For example, you need to comply with zoning and local bylaws as well. And I had a look at a specific bylaw when I was going over this material, and at least in the city of Toronto, they listed for this certain property that some permitted uses at this particular unit was offices, a photography studio, an art studio, or similar occupancies like that. They specifically restricted laundromats, dry cleaners. I think they had a pet shop and actually and an auctioneer location that was also part of the restriction. Okay, so this scenario is, I think, similar to the example that Maurice pulled up for his Wilson building. So this is a case where if a tenant is thinking, well, could I lease my residential component to someone else and I work on the ground floor as in the work component? And at least from the building code standpoint, once you start leasing these to separate entities, it starts looking more like a conventional multi-tenant floor levels with singular occupancies. And because of this, you need to provide fire protection and life safety that's a bit more conventional rather than for live work units. For example, you're looking at providing fire-rated floor assemblies between the first two levels of the building. In terms of egress and exiting, you're making provisions to provide access to exits directly on those floor levels rather than having an open stair between the floor levels. So, but there is flexibility once you start compartmentalizing these floors and these units. For example, the work component is no longer listed or limited to Group D and F Division 3. You could have a shop, so a Group E occupancy. As well, under the definition, it says that your unit can't be more than 200 square meters. As a more conventional unit, you're no longer limited by that size. So in terms of flexibility, from our standpoint, it's always important to consider all these things ahead of time before, if at the end you do want flexibility for your unit. So you're looking at things like egress, access to exits, fire protection, barrier-free accessibility. That's it for me.
Thank you. And last but not least, Isaiah from TAS for 888 DuPont.
Awesome. Thanks. So for those who don't know me, I'm John. I'm a development manager with TAS. As a brief introduction to those who might not be familiar with TAS, we like to describe ourselves as an unconventional impact company that uses real estate as a tool. Off the great presentations from the other panelists by offering some insight into a unique project that we're currently developing at TAS that ties nicely into today's topic. And that project is our entirely live work building at 888 Dupont Street in Toronto. So I'm hoping that I can provide some high-level insight over the next several minutes into how the project evolved into what it is today, what the rezoning permissions looked like, and some of the challenges that we've had to overcome along the way, along with some forward-looking thoughts on how the design and the programming of the project is really what will bring it to life. So for context, 888 Dupont has been an iconic fixture on the Dupont Street corridor for over a century. It's forever been a place for making, from its initial use as a yarn factory to its more recent use as a host to a mix of creative industry tenants, from photographers to musicians and more. It's situated at the corner of Dupont and Ossington, and is uniquely located at the convergence of several vibrant neighborhoods, including Gary Street, which has transformed over the years into a lively hub for arts, culture, production, and nightlife, and also the Dupont Street corridor, which is another formerly industrial strip that has seen rapid redevelopment over the last several years. So with this context in mind, we were determined to honor the creative energy historically found at 888 Dupont and in the surrounding neighborhood through the redevelopment of the site. So the project aims to maintain the building's role as a community hub, a place of local production and innovation, and to expand and build on the community and creativity that's existed here for so many years. Overall, the project consists of about 190 live-work units and a dynamic mix of community and cultural spaces like performance spaces, co-working, and maker spaces, ultimately all creating an ecosystem of flexible, purposeful spaces for people to live, work, socialize, and create. So what does that actually look like through the rezoning of the site? Then live-work units specifically, all the units at 888 Dupont are actually zoned for residential use. And what sets them apart is that they actually have expanded permissions for home occupations, which allows residents to operate businesses from their units. So residents can sell, rent, lease physical goods, have personal service shops or offices, and have clients or customers attend the premises. Given that there weren't precedents for buildings like this in Toronto, it took quite a bit of collaboration between our team and the City of Toronto to make sure that everybody was comfortable with how the building would function. In the end, we agreed on several parameters to address the main concerns, the first of which was that uses could not be obnoxious. Now, while this language is quite general, the intent was to avoid any issues between conflicting uses, such as the unit that was being used primarily for residential use, which happened to be adjacent to a unit that was doing some sort of production. For that same reason, music and dance and training were actually limited to the lower floors in the building. The second parameter was that the ground floor 2-level units required the work function to be located on the bottom level, similar to the examples we've seen from the other panelists today. And this would ensure that there was retail animation on the ground level and that there was still privacy for the live function on the upper level. And then finally, the last parameter was that home occupations were required to be the principal residence of the business operator above a certain level in the building. And similar to the first point, this was decided upon in an effort to avoid conflicting uses. And while these parameters did limit flexibility to a certain extent, we felt that it was still a huge step in the right direction towards more flexible buildings in the future, and that with the right design and programming, the building could still successfully function as we had intended. So we're currently in the process of designing the units and amenities for the building. So I don't actually have a completed product that I can show you all quite yet, but I thought it would be of interest to maybe give you a sneak peek at some early studies and explorations. So unfortunately, the economics in today's market don't make big sprawling lofts like the traditional live-work units that we used to see in old industrial buildings possible. As Maurice mentioned earlier, the sticker price is just for those, and hopefully that gets better in the future, but where the prices are for units today, that sticker prices is just prohibitive. So rather, we feel live work in a modern context is all about thoughtful, flexible design that allows residents to optimize what they get out of their spaces. And the real value proposition that live work at 888 Dupont will offer is that rather than renting or buying a residential unit plus having a separate commercial unit or co-working membership for your business, a flexible unit design can have the ability to host both functions, while the amenity space can offer all the extended needs for work life, such as meeting rooms, presentation space, packing, shipping, receiving, and retail opportunities. One of the key considerations that we've been thinking about while designing the unit so far is creating the flexibility to separate private versus public space. And this can be seen in the blue areas represent the zones that can be privatized during business hours, which is particularly helpful for those of us who don't like to make our beds in the morning, whereas the pig zones are for the more common uses to support both functions. So in closing, we still have a long way to go on the design, but it's been an exciting and challenging process so far, and I'm hoping that this project can offer a glimmer of hope into a future of more flexible buildings in Toronto and abroad.
Thank you, Isaiah. Okay, Isaiah, if you have like headphones or mic or like a small mic, because you had some waves, I could have like we heard you, but if for the Q&A you are able to quickly grab something, that would be great. If not, that's totally fine. Try to maybe not cover your mic with your elbow or something. Okay, so first of all, we do have some Q&A, and Isaiah's last slide reminded me of a really cool YouTube channel called Never Too Small, and it is a really, really cool. Basically, you know what? Just go to YouTube and search for Never Too Small. Okay. So we have some questions. Maurice, I believe some of them were addressed to you, and now I lost it. The first one. Okay. Maurice, the first one. And by the way, dear audience, I thought of doing something new. And if any one of you would like to get on, to open your mic and speak up, I thought of having like a little bit more of an interactive format than what is usually being done. So if any of you would like to speak up, you can do like ask to talk, and I will allow you to participate as basically a speaker. Okay, Maurice, first question is up. This one is for you. Have you faced difficulties with zoning bylaw defined uses? For example, not all zoning bylaws define live work. I guess it's a question for everyone, but I saw it coming up after your presentation.
Yeah. On a site-specific zoning bylaw amendment, there's going to be a lot of gray area in terms of what gets included and not. I think that both Sujin and Jeffrey on the OBC component that you also touched on, what happens at the zoning level. Mentioned, I guess after this question popped up, some of the allowances, some of the restrictions. I think that there's definitely difficulties. I'm not sure I'm reading the question correctly, but I do want to talk about some of the difficulties that come with having the type of restrictions that we do. And I think that it really is, to sort of make an overarching comment, it really is site-specific, project-specific negotiation that happens between city staff and the applicant team, let's say, where there maybe is some more flexibility given to what can be included in the bylaw, or in some cases there's reasons for the bylaw to be very prescriptive. I think that generally we saw some of the uses that are allowed in the OBC, and I guess when you layer on building code and zoning allowances, you start really narrowing the type of uses that you can have. I saw that there was a question further down about, are you allowed to have a restaurant on the first level?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I showed an example of I think we're all familiar with Kibo, the sushi joint chain. And I showed an example of a Kibo occupying one of these workspaces within the live work unit. Is it allowed? I don't know. I think from a zoning perspective, a restaurant is technically retail.
Retail, yeah, that's.
Yeah, so I can add my perspective on that question. So restaurants are typically classified as either Group A assembly occupancy, or if you're 30 seats and under, it allows you to be a Group E mercantile occupancy. But in either case, they don't fit in with the definition of a live work unit, which is only Group D or F Division 3. So I would say no, under the building code, you couldn't have a restaurant in first level.
Yeah, and just for the sake of definition, the building code is the non-negotiable piece of document, while the zoning is where you literally rewrite the zoning with the submission. So there is more flexibility there. So Jen, I wanted to talk to you and I want to share the experience that I had. So City Place, for those of you who don't know, when it was first planned, they said, let's have all at-grade units as live work. And with time, where density could support retail, we will allow those units could convert over time to commercial or office uses. And I had this experience. I go to City Place every week for the community center, and I was looking for a coffee place, and I had to Google that. And the coffee place or the coffee shop was right across the street from me, and I didn't see it because it was behind the landscape that was a landscape setback with landscape that was designed for the residential usage. So Sujin, you kind of touched on that, on those. If it's residential, you need setback. If it's commercial or whatever, you don't. And then how can we design for future flexibility? Retail or commercial, doesn't matter, also requires different code or different, higher ceiling heights. So how as an architect would you tackle that?
Sure. Yeah. Like for instance, that one project I referred to, we wanted to do live work at grade. It was sort of a 2-level unit where the commercial was at grade and the residential was above. To go back to the question on difficulties with the zoning bylaw, when we submitted that to the city, we had 2 different types of responses from planning. They basically said, because live work is residential in use, you need this front yard setback. Meanwhile, engineering and construction services says, well, because there's a commercial component, city doesn't pick up garbage from commercial areas, so you need to separate. And, after much back and forth, the client reverted back to a traditional retail at grade and residential above. So, piggybacking on some of the other panelist presentations, there was still a 2-story unit and there was an interior stair, but now this interior stair needed to be a fire rated stair, properly separating the 2 uses. And so I think, that might be one way around sort of these non-OBC conforming uses, like if you wanted to put a bakery or if you wanted to put a coffee shop, it would be a different type of agreement in terms of the live work component, similar to what Maurice had shown as basically separate elements. I do think from a planning principle, because live work is looked at as residential in nature and with this 3-meter setback, that really kneecaps any future flexibility for commercial viability. Because commercial viability is all about street frontage, it's all about signage, it's all about presence on the street. And the minute you're forced to do a setback to address a residential type of, I completely understand the need for that privacy, but when your built form is set back like that, it really handicaps a future ability to convert it to a commercial. One of the zoning requirements is your ground floor has to be at minimum height, at least in the city of Toronto. One option is, if you could allow this live work at grade, can you not require, like instead of a 3-meter front yard setback, a 3-meter interior setback that is required for commercial use as minimum, right? Like I think there are other, considerations that can allow the built form for that future flexibility without necessarily compromising some of like the privacy versus public realm issues. So those are my thoughts on that front.
Maurice, there's a question, first of all, for the person and the anonymous attendee who wrote about the live work effect occupancy levels. If just clarify if you mean from a code perspective or any other perspective. Maurice, there's a question about tax, property tax. Can you speak to that, or we have no one to? If you can't, I don't know who would. The question is, how does MPAC view the live work unit? Will the property tax be split into commercial and residential portions? I think the answer is yes, right, Maureen?
I'm not sure, but my guess would be that it is split.
Yeah.
I doubt it would be looked at as a conventional residential unit.
I think, yes, Alex, I'm pretty sure I also heard it from other clients, that there's a split, and even like the GFA, like there's an imaginary line for the GFA that is the commercial uses, and that counts also for like anything like that falls under that. So it could be also like employment conversion, because you have very specific dedication of how much area is used for commercial versus residential. Okay. How do we maintain the activity that is part of the work part? Change of ownership cannot be dictated, and many former live work wind up with curtains drawn permanently as the units evolve into live only. Any comments on that from anyone on the panel? I think it's interesting. Not far away from our office, we see that a lot, and the units at grade, regardless of them being live work or not. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting condition. Sujin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges of live work is it residential, is it commercial? You know, we say it can be both, but does that also mean it can be either or? You know, I read somewhere about, you know, how the city of Toronto doesn't really have current stats on live work because a lot of them actually did revert to residential. So that's an interesting question. It comes back to some of the legal aspects of either contract, tenant rental rights. You know, is this a commercial contract in nature? Is it residential? And how do you actually enforce this post-occupancy? I don't really have any answers for that. It's more just other questions.
Jeff, if you could see one of the questions about the OBC, I think it has two parts. I will read Sammy's question for now, and that will be the last question, and then we'll do like a really quick round of asking you where you think the future of you know, flexibility in uses is going to be, and we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to ask Sammy's question now. As we are seeing more co-working spaces as part of condo amenity offering, does anyone on the panel have thoughts about the viability of creating ground floor co-working spaces that could do multiple things? One, be part of the required residential amenity, and two, be open to public use, just like any third-party co-working space. And three, help to satisfy the city's ask for street-related commercial spaces that activate the public realm. Any thoughts on Sammy's comment? Or experience with co-working spaces? As I guess what's interesting, Sammy, is that the dual use is that it's a condo amenity that could make profit, right? And I think on its own, and I think that's for the, and maybe perhaps for the condo board, and I think that's interesting.
There are other aspects, Nama, on that one as well. You know, again, it comes down to sort of rights of the residents as a public, as a residential amenity to the space, versus the realities of, you know, third-party co-working spaces. They want to make money and they're market-driven, and so understanding, you know, that aspect, and then also understanding whether city can accept that. So that would be, I think, a negotiation to be had with the city on whether they would accept sort of a market space as a for standard commercial use as an amenity space to a development.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting conundrum because I think you're almost double counting, right? It's commercial space, it's revenue producing space. It's not a dedicated amenity for the residents of the building as a, you know, an extension of their living space. So maybe there is some flexibility from the city's perspective to allow for some double counting. But if I were to be underwriting a new deal and hedging and being conservative, I would look at it as two distinct and separate elements. Perhaps you can double count and get lucky sometimes.
Jeffrey, do you want to answer the code question?
Sure. Do you want me to read the question?
Go for it.
Okay. With regards to the occupancy levels, my question is from OBC perspective. As we have potential customers in the daytime, the occupancy level will increase in the day. In a typical condo, the occupancy level is fixed. So I'm not sure what your direct question is, but I'll hazard a guess. I'm thinking you're trying to consider the occupant load number for your unit and maybe the condo as a whole. So in terms of occupant load, that should be considered at the fit out stage of either the unit or at the base building design stage. So they'll consider things like access to exit capacity, and washroom capacity. So those, as long as, and this goes not just for live work units, but this is any occupancy. You need to respect your washroom capacity and your exit capacity. So as long as you don't exceed those levels, then it should be fine.
Let's wrap up with a really quick, round. Where do you think future development and offering flexibility, and take it to whatever place you want to? Maurice, let's just follow the order of the presentations. Maurice, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that we're all talking about, at a macro level, city planning in a way that includes all uses, and that we're growing in a way that's proportionate to the needs of our population. So not just build more housing, but also build more space for people to work. And we all know what the market in the office sector has gone through. And that's why at the beginning I was sort of hinting at it. Is this a sector in the market that's going to have a new opportunity, a new viability, with also, I think, a trend in cities like Toronto and in lots of places within the city, there are niches of creative communities, and being able to have that sort of artisanal space that works together and complements the live space, and gets us into spaces that are, they're not retail, they're not commercial, they're places for making, right? And I think it's an exciting sector. I see a lot more of it happening.
So Jim, are you muted?
Sorry. Yeah, I think, definitely incorporating flexibility is paramount in this. If you go back to, how work is evolving in every aspect, whether it's, working from home, whether it's how we work, how consumers consume, you see a rise of ghost kitchens, as a result of, the pandemic, where you don't need a retail shop anymore. You just need to be able to produce and market it somewhere in the online web. And so how people are working is changing and will continue to change. So I think the built form, as that responds to it, needs to be flexible. It needs to allow for the changes. When I think back to the first definition of live work, that was in 1986. Back then, there were no cell phones. It was a landline. And I don't even think call waiting existed back then. And so when we look at certain definitions that apply now, how outdated are these definitions and what's the future evolution of these things? I think all of that needs to be taken into consideration in order to develop a built form that will actually capture all of that.
Jeffrey, building code and flexibility are not exactly, but what do you think?
I mean, there is flexibility, but just hopping on to Sujean's point, like I think flexibility is important and it should be considered as early as you can in the design process. So, so that you plan for the changes ahead of time, like providing additional exits if it needs to be. It's always easier to do it at the beginning rather than go somewhere down in the line in future, upgrading your unit to provide all these extra provisions. So that's my encouragement, is just to get the big picture at the beginning if you can, and then it's always easier that way.
Isaiah, you're muted as well. What? No. Okay, now.
That's better. So I think flexibility is key. I think the more of these, smaller live work units that we can have in the city, I think it gives more people an opportunity to start businesses, open up new shops. And I think in the end, it lends to a more exciting city. So I think it's a trend that I'm kind of excited to see continue. And I have, high hopes for what it can actually do to the city in the long run.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this new format. Maurice, Sujean, Jeffrey, and Isaiah, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Have a great rest of the week. Let's get back.